All right, students. So this is going to be a relatively brief presentation on risk, safety, and whistleblowing. Things that we need to think about, especially in engineering professions and in computer science professions. So here are a number of the factors related to risk and sort of broken down into different categories. First question you should ask is this risk voluntary or involuntary? That's going to be the most critical question when considering the moral permissibility of exposing consumers to some sort of risk. Do the consumers who are exposed to the risk consent to that risk? And this will differ depending on the particular details of the risk involved. So, for example, a voluntary risk would be something that people were quite aware of when they bought the product. So, for example, if you buy a gun, you're engaging in a voluntary risk because guns can be used to kill people, and they can also lead to accidents that are fatal. An involuntary risk is if there's some detail about the product that people don't know about that could nevertheless cause them harm. So GM had a issue with ignition switches in the first decade of the 21st century. And in that issue, the drivers did not understand that their vehicle could go into basically a stall in the middle of the freeway, which would make their airbags stop working. That is not a risk that consumers consented to in buying that vehicle. They did not know about the risk. They cannot consent to something that they don't know about. Okay, short-term versus permanent risk. So some risks that you might have are risks that someone might get bruised or might get hurt temporarily, as opposed to, of course, permanent risks. So if you have a, circular saw that doesn't work in the way that other previous circular saws manufactured work, so that someone who is trained to use the previous type of circular saw wouldn't be trained to use this type of saw, and they didn't know about it. So if we make it an involuntary risk, here we have permanent risk, because the dangers of misusing a circular saw could involve having one or fewer limbs, which is really not something that you want. Losing hands, losing arms, not a cool thing. Probability of danger is another factor, right? So perhaps the probability of a bad thing happening is very low. In that case, the risk becomes relatively more acceptable compared to the probability of the bad thing happening being very high. Reversibility of effects. If this thing happens, can we undo it? Can we fix the problem? Can we fix the damage? Or is this a form of damage that once it happens cannot be undone? And then immediate or delayed risk. This is a factor that will occur to various levels in various cases. So one case that we might look at is cell phones. If we look at the claims that some have made that cell phones could be harmful to your brain, could cause cancer, things like that. Now, we don't have very solid data on that happening. We don't have a great number of cases where that has plausibly happened. But when we look at something like that, we would expect it to be a delayed risk. And so, because we know that people don't drop dead from using cell phones. So that would be a case of a delayed risk. And we would want to look at the other factors here. Now, there's a question of how much we should count delayed risks as opposed to immediate risks, whether immediate risks are more critical to avoid than delayed risks. I think that one answer to this question is that Immediate risks are more probable, more predictable, more reliable to happen, all things being equal, than delayed risks. So we may factor immediate risks more, but delayed risks involve the same amount of harm were they to happen. So when we think about things like how do we respond to climate change, a lot of those risks, not all of them, but a lot of those risks are delayed risks. But I would encourage us not to think of them as thereby less critical. There may be more unpredictability involved, and when there's more unpredictability involved, we may have less urgency in acting, but it doesn't make the potential for harm any less. Now, whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is when you are in an organization. You've already watched a video on this. This is when you are in an organization and you blow the whistle. You say something's wrong, some harm is occurring, or some lying is occurring. There's some violation of the code of ethics, and I'm not okay with that. And you let people know in order to make it stop. Two types of whistleblowing, two ways of dividing it into two types. One is internal versus external whistleblowing. Internal whistleblowing stays within the company. Involves going over the head of your supervisor. First, you obviously should have talked to your supervisor first, but going over her head, or going over the head of the person who's over her, right? You continue to go up the chain. External whistleblowing involves drawing in the legal system, drawing in the press, drawing in regulators and letting them know about what's going on, drawing in the state. Two types of whistleblowing, and another way of dividing it is acknowledged whistleblowing versus anonymous whistleblowing. So anonymous whistleblowing, your name isn't attached. That doesn't mean that it couldn't come back to haunt you, that there couldn't be some way that you're outed, that people find out what your name is. But to start with, your name isn't attached. And acknowledged whistleblowing involves letting people know exactly who you are. In the coronavirus crisis, there have been a number of nurses and medical professionals who have said the conditions in the hospitals are absolutely terrible. Everybody needs to know this. This is, if they put their name behind it, this is acknowledged whistleblowing. But in doing that, they risk their jobs. They risk their jobs. They risk their livelihoods, because one thing that companies do when you whistleblow and they know who you are is they may fire you. Now, there are laws to protect whistleblowers, but those laws are a hodgepodge of different different case law that doesn't necessarily cover every case that we would want it to cover. So if you talk about which is preferred in these two areas of two types of whistleblowing, the general consensus, and this is not just the consensus, but it seems like the moral thing to do, is to begin by internal whistleblowing if you can, then move to external whistleblowing. And if you use your name, if your name is behind it, if you acknowledge who you are, that is generally going to be a much more effective form of whistleblowing, because when your name is behind something, you're putting your credibility on the line. You can say all sorts of anonymous things, and people could wonder what your motivation was, because you're not willing to put your credibility on the line. So we talked a little bit about, again, being fired, bad consequences that whistleblowing has. One other bad consequence is that you can be blacklisted. That is, you can your name can be spread from company to company. You can lose your possibility of getting good recommendations, job recommendations, and possibly lose your possibility of getting a job because you've been blacklisted. So this is a set of obligations in whistleblowing. This is sort of a standard view of whistleblowing, that you should have sufficient evidence or acquire sufficient evidence before you whistleblow, that you should address the issue with your immediate supervisor, and then address the issue with the people over your supervisor. Think about this. If you were the CEO of a company and the first time that you found out that something shady was going on within your company was when it was posted on the front page of the New York Times, wouldn't that piss you off? It would piss me off, right? So you want to treat people the way they would want to be, that you would want to be treated in the same situation. This is the golden rule. So I would recommend that you stay within the company as much as you can, because it's just a decent way of treating human beings. Now, there may be cases in which there's so much fear of reprisal, or even in extreme cases, fear of personal safety, that it would be reasonable to go outside of the organization before reporting things within the organization. 4, seek advice to whatever degree possible. I very strongly would recommend this. Talk to other coworkers about the issue. You may want to seek safety in numbers. Moreover, you should talk to lawyers before you take certain steps, because you may not know all the ramifications of that legally. Consider whether the costs of whistleblowing are greater than the benefits. If the cost of whistleblowing will involve a massive number of competent people being fired, and it won't solve the problem, then you might want to consider whether that's a worse outcome, right? Then contact the final step. Once you've done all the other things, you contact the regulatory organization or the press. Generally, this shouldn't be done by just spreading rumors. You should use reputable sources to spread the information about what's actually going on. Now, one question that you might have in whistleblowing is the question of complicity. This is another approach to things. This is the question: if I didn't whistleblow, have I become a person that is causing the bad thing to happen? Perhaps I'm signing the papers. Perhaps I'm processing the materials. But one way or another, I am in the causal chain that allows the bad thing to happen. If I'm in that causal chain, if I know about what's going on and I'm supporting what's going on through just doing my job, that means I'm complicit. I'm part of the problem. And if I'm part of the problem, that's not something that you can justify in ordinary circumstances. And there, if the question becomes either I whistleblow or I remain part of the problem, that brings a much stronger duty to whistleblow. If you're not complicit in the wrongdoing, then this is what we call a Good Samaritan situation. You see something bad going on. You see someone, like, to use a grade school example, you see some kid being bullied at recess on the playground. And then you have the question, do I do something about it? So this is a situation that you're not complicit in the actual activity, but you have the possibility of keeping it from being done. And I still think that in most cases there's a moral obligation here, but the moral obligation is much less strong than if you were one of the kids that was de facto bullying, if you were complicit. Now, a slightly different issue, the concept of professionalism. Professionalism involves handling yourself as a person who has special responsibility in a situation, because you are entrusted by society with a certain responsibility. So we can say doctors are professionals. They're entrusted with our health. Okay, we can say lawyers are professionals. They're entrusted with our with justice for individuals. In the same way, engineers and computer scientists are professionals because they're entrusted with the safety and security, privacy um, of our technology, um, from bridges and cars to computer systems and apps. So you have a duty to handle yourself in a way that brings respect and esteem to your profession. Uh, Involved in this is what's called the right of conscientious refusal. You have a right to refuse to do anything that you believe to be unethical. You have a moral right. Is this a legal right? No, it's not a legal right. You may be fired if you refuse to do something you believe to be unethical. You may be demoted. Uh, you may have your name run through the mud. You may even, in extreme cases, be arrested for refusing to do something you believe to be unethical if your contract requires you to do it. Nevertheless, morally, you have the right. Morally, you have the notion of integrity where you act based on your moral beliefs, based on your moral convictions. So I think it's critical to realize that there's this other notion besides the legality of an action, besides whether you are following the company's rules, that you have a right to refuse. This is different from whistleblowing because just refusing to do something is not notifying the public that it's going on. Perhaps the public wouldn't care. Perhaps there's something that you think is wrong, but the public wouldn't really make a big deal about. So conscientiously, you have the right to refuse, but you also have consequences that could occur if you do so. And then there's a whole set of various situations in the ethics of engineering and computer science, which involve prudence, which is good judgment. So should you follow your company's policies on confidentiality and disclosure? Well, sometimes that, often that would be a good thing, but sometimes those policies are written not to defend the public and the public's interest, but to defend the company and the company's interests. And in those cases, it may be wise to violate your company policies, but you should realize when you do that that you're walking a thin line. Avoiding conflicts of interest and the appearance of conflicts of interest. We talked about that when talking about codes of ethics. And fairly and honestly engaging in competitive bidding. So competitive bidding is when there are a set of different organizations competing for the same contract from another organization or from the state or the city. And it's very common in competitive bidding for people to lie and say that something will cost less than they know it will cost. So that is an unfair and dishonest business practice in general. But there's also the question, if this is sufficiently common, if literally everyone else is doing it, to what degree is it just an understood practice that people will do this? And to what degree could it become permissible for me to do it? I have no magic bullet answer on that question, but it's something that you need to use prudence and good judgment. At the very least, you need not to be part of the problem. You need to not be making the problem worse. So anyway, these are some thoughts on professionalism, on risk and safety, and on whistleblowing, and I hope that you find them helpful.